and I'm very excited to teach you about learning today. Chapter 6 is one of my favorites, which is why I'm so excited. Before we talk about learning, let's go over unlearned behavior first. As humans and all species of animals are born with certain instincts and reflexes. Let's go over the difference real quick. An instinct involves a complex pattern of behaviors. It usually involves moving your whole body. So bees have an instinct to build a hive and to pollinate. Birds have an instinct to make a nest and feed their young. Baby humans have an instinct to suck, and dogs have an instinct to fetch. These are all different instincts that different species have. It's an instinct because it involves some sort of thought process and moving of your body, but it's not something that has to be learned. It's something that these species are born with. Reflexes are also something we're born with, but we don't think about them. They're immediate, and they usually just involve one type of movement, not something as complex as making a hive or fetching a stick, but something more like pulling your hand back from a hot stove. Babies are born with several reflexes. One is that when you put your finger in their hand, they will grasp it. Another one, pictured with those cute little baby feet, is called the Babinski reflex. If you rub your finger up a baby's foot, up the bottom of its foot, it will splay its toes out, like spread its toes out. It's called the Babinski reflex. And I think we're all familiar with the knee reflex. When you go to the doctor and they tap your knee, you don't even have to think about it. You automatically kick that foot up. That's a reflex. So again, instincts are involve more thought processes and moving your whole body. Reflexes are immediate and usually just involve one part of your body. Now let's get into the good stuff. Learning. What is learning? Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that results from experience. So relatively permanent. We'll talk about that later. Sometimes we can forget or unlearn things. And associative learning occurs when an organism makes connections between stimuli or events that occur together in the environment. The first two types of learning we're going to talk about today are both associative learning, classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Observational learning is a little bit different. Real quick, I'm going to summarize the three types of learning, and then we'll spend the rest of the chapter going into the details of these three types of learning. First, we will talk about classical conditioning. With classical conditioning, we're associating a natural response with a neutral stimulus, like when a dog salivates over a sound of a bell. We'll talk about it in a moment. Operant conditioning is reinforcement and punishment, trying to increase or decrease behaviors with reinforcement or punishment. And finally, observational learning or social learning happens by watching and imitating others. So first we'll talk about classical conditioning, then operant conditioning, and then observational learning with a summary at the end as usual. Ivan Pavlov is the big guy in charge of classical conditioning, but also Watson was another famous behaviorist who used classical conditioning. For classical conditioning, we want to pair an unconditioned stimulus, something that we naturally already have a response to, with a neutral stimulus, something new, to teach the person or the animal or the subject to have that response to the neutral stimulus. Let me explain. Dogs naturally salivate or drool when they see meat or food. If you show a dog a steak, the dog will naturally start to drool. This is not something he learned. This is a reflex that he's born with, an unconditioned response. He did not need to be conditioned. He was just born that way, drooling over meat. And if you ring a bell, a dog won't respond at all. They don't know what to do when you ring a bell, and they certainly wouldn't drool over a bell because they don't want to eat it. However, if every time you show the dog the meat, you also ring a bell over and over, here's the meat, ding, 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 and he drools because he sees the meat. Look at this meat. Ding, ding, ding. And he drools because he sees the meat. Eventually, you can get rid of the meat, and just ringing the bell will make the dog drool. We have conditioned the dog to give a conditioned response to what is now a conditioned stimulus. So we started with an unconditioned stimulus, the meat, and an unconditioned response, drooling over meat. We say unconditioned because they didn't need to be conditioned or taught. We added the neutral stimulus of the bell to the unconditioned stimulus, meat, and together they elicited the unconditioned response of drooling. After many times of pairing the bell and the meat, eventually the neutral stimulus of bell becomes a conditioned stimulus, bell, which elicits a conditioned response, drooling. And even with no meat anywhere nearby, you ring that bell, the dog will drool. He learned. This is learning or conditioning. Over to the example on the right side, Watson is a very famous psychologist who's probably most famous for his experiment on little Albert. What Watson did was he exposed a tiny baby named little Albert to lots of different stimuli, none of which scared him. They showed him a mask and a stuffed toy and a rat, and none of these things scared little baby Albert. However, loud noises scare all babies. It's something we're just born with. It's an unconditioned response. Babies cry in response to loud noises. So, just like Pavlov paired the bell and the meat to get the dog to drool, Watson paired a loud noise with the rat to condition fear. He wanted to see if he could not just elicit something like drooling, but actually tap into human emotions and teach fear. And it turns out little Albert was able to learn fear. After several pairings of loud noises with the white rat, little Albert became very scared of white rats. And in fact, little Albert also became scared of other small, white, furry animals, which was very interesting. We'll talk about that again in a moment, little Albert. Now that we know the general idea of classical conditioning, let's talk about higher order conditioning. So higher order conditioning means that after we've already paired one neutral stimulus, we pair it with a second neutral stimulus. Let's look at this example. The metronome, instead of a bell, is followed by food and makes the dog drool, right? So the metronome becomes the conditioned stimulus. When the dog hears that sound of the metronome, he will start to drool because he knows the food is coming. So even once the food is removed from the situation, the dog now drools over the sound of the metronome. Now the experimenter pairs a black square with a metronome. So no more food, but the dog has already been conditioned to drool over the sound of the metronome. So they pair a black square with the metronome and present it to the dog several times, and eventually the dog becomes conditioned to drool over the black square. This is called second order or higher order conditioning because we never paired the black square with the food. Food is the unconditioned stimulus, something the dog was born drooling over. But without ever pairing the black square with the food, we were able to teach the dog to drool over the black square. We did higher order conditioning. First, we paired the metronome with the food, and once the metronome had become conditioned and the dog drooled over the metronome, we paired it with the square for higher order conditioning. Now, it's been found that going more than 2 steps is very difficult. Now that the dog is drooling over the black square, if we paired the black square with a third neutral stimulus, it's very unlikely the dog would ever drool over that. 2 is kind of maxed out in how far you can go with the conditioning. Let's talk about what happens with conditioning when it's time for extinction. Remember earlier I mentioned unlearning or forgetting. Extinction means when a behavior stops. So it's sort of like unlearning. And what happens is after you stop pairing the 2 things, over time the dog will stop drooling over the bell, for example. right? So if we look at the beginning of the graph during the acquisition phase, I'm pairing my conditioned stimulus, which is meat that the dog drools over, with my unconditioned stimulus, the bell. And over time, the drooling over the bell goes up and up and up. The strength of that conditioned response, the drooling over the bell, increases and increases the more that we pair the food and the bell. Once that's been created, we decide to try extinction. So now we keep ringing that bell and never pair it with food again. Ring, 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 no meat. Ring it again, still no meat. After many times of ringing that bell without any meat or food, the dog is going to stop salivating over the bell. He will eventually learn that the bell no longer symbolizes food, it no longer signals food, it's not paired anymore, and the dog will stop drooling over the bell. However, if we take a little break, we don't feed him, we don't ring the bell, we don't do anything that looks like this experiment, and then we try ring that bell again, something happens which is called spontaneous recovery. The dog had stopped drooling over the bell, and now he starts again without a new pairing. We didn't pair it with the food again, but he spontaneously started drooling over the bell again after a pause in extinction. I find this very interesting. So let me just review that again real quick. We paired the meat with the bell, and eventually the dog drools over the bell. Then we keep ringing that bell with no meat at all. Eventually the dog stops drooling over the bell. We take a break from the whole entire thing, ring the bell, and the dog will drool again. We just keep ringing that bell, though, with no meat, and eventually the extinction continues and the dog won't drool over the bell again. So after a break from the conditioning, the conditioned response reappears. This indicates spontaneous recovery. Spontaneous recovery is when the conditioned response starts up again after a break in conditioning. All right, remember earlier I mentioned that little Albert, that baby, became afraid of all small furry animals? He became afraid of all white small furry animals and even maybe some light colored ones like a hamster. However, he did not become scared of big black dogs, even though they're furry. He didn't even become scared of big white dogs, in fact. So stimulus generalization is what we call all those furry animals Albert did become afraid of. Everything that was similar enough to that white rat is stimulus generalization. For example, with the dogs and the bell and the meat, if I rang a bell that sounded almost the same, the dogs would likely still salivate. But if I made a noise that didn't sound the same at all, they would have no reason to salivate over it. Stimulus generalization is when the conditioned response occurs in relation to very similar stimuli to the neutral one that has been conditioned. And stimulus discrimination are stimuli that are different enough from the one that's been conditioned that they don't elicit the conditioned response. So all of those small little furry animals that Albert became afraid of were a result of stimulus generalization, but the fact that he did not become afraid of all animals shows stimulus discrimination, even in a little baby. That's it for classical conditioning. On to one of my favorites, operant conditioning. This dude over here, B.F. Skinner, is the father of operant conditioning. He may even be considered the father of behaviorism. B.F. Skinner looked at Pavlov's work and Watson's work with little Albert and saw that classical conditioning is limited to existing behaviors that are reflexively elicited. It does not account for new behaviors. So classical conditioning, Skinner pointed out, only works for reflexes, right? We automatically are scared of loud noises as a baby, and dogs drool over food, so it's easy to pair other things with that. But what about things that the response is not reflex, right? If we want to teach somebody how to ride a bike, or teach a child to use the bathroom instead of their diaper, or get a dog to stop chewing on the furniture, right? All of these things are not reflexes. We need to actually teach them. So more serious learning needs to go on here. And Skinner invented something called the Skinner box, which a rat goes inside the box and presses a lever which can deliver food. And we're going to learn about different types of operant conditioning and how Skinner used his Skinner box to understand them. First, let's talk real quick about the law of effect. According to the law of effect, behaviors that are followed by consequences that are satisfying to the organism are more likely to be repeated, and behaviors that are followed by unpleasant consequences are less likely to be repeated. Right? Makes sense. If you do something and it's followed by a pleasant consequence, you're more likely to keep doing that thing. However, if you do something and it's followed by an unpleasant consequence, you're less likely. So let's look at the rat in the Skinner box. If he presses that lever and food comes out, he's going to want to press that lever more. But if he presses that lever and that electric grating under him shocks him, that's a bad thing. He's going to stop pressing that lever pretty quickly, right? So it seems kind of common sense, but it's really important to understand in learning, or that for operant conditioning as opposed to classical conditioning, it's what happens right after, right? With classical conditioning, it was what happens before. We ring the bell right before we give the dogs the meat, right? We show baby Albert the rat right before we bang, or we bang the thing right as we're showing him the rat. We bang the hammer. It happens at the same time, or it happens before. Usually actually at the same time for classical conditioning. But for operant conditioning, it's the effect, what happens after, the consequence. I love this Simpsons example for operant conditioning. You do not have to watch The Simpsons to understand it. Let's look at negative and positive reinforcement first. Reinforcement increases a behavior, a desired behavior. So in the first example, the desired behavior is taking out the trash. Negative reinforcement means that something bad is removed when you do the desired behavior. So again, reinforcement increases a behavior, but it does it by removing something bad. Your prize is not that you get a prize, it's that they take away something you don't like. So in this Simpsons example, their house was very stinky because it was full of trash. Homer took out the trash and was rewarded by the house not being stinky anymore. So something bad, stinky house, was removed to reinforce his behavior. And Homer will likely take out the trash more often because it was reinforced by getting rid of the stinky smell in his house. Positive reinforcement also increases a behavior. All reinforcement increases the behavior, but positive reinforcement does it by adding something rewarding. The prize is getting something as opposed to losing something bad. So this time, the behavior we want is for Bart to study, and he's reinforced with the good grades and the praise and maybe some Christmas presents from Mom. So he's given good things for studying. He will study again next time because last time he studied, his mom was proud and he got presents. So both negative and positive reinforcement increase the behavior, but negative reinforcement does it by removing something bad, and positive reinforcement does it by adding something good. Moving on to punishment. Just like reinforcement increases behavior, punishment decreases behavior. Both types of punishment decrease an undesirable behavior, a behavior that we want to stop. So on the left example, Bart has to write lines on the board, and that's going to decrease his negative behavior. They added a punishment, writing lines, to get him to stop. What was he doing? Cursive writing does not mean what I think it does. I'm not sure what that means, but whatever they want him to stop doing, they're going to get him to stop by writing those lines on the board. Moving on to the skateboard example, they're going to get him to stop his negative behavior by taking away the skateboard. So both types of punishment get Bart to stop his negative behavior, but positive punishment makes him stop by adding something like writing lines, and negative punishment gets him to stop by removing something like taking away his skateboard. right? There's both kinds of punishments. Something can be added that's negative, or something you like can be taken away, right? As a parent, I can punish my kids by making them go sit in timeout. I'm adding a punishment. Or I can take something away like their iPad, and then that's a negative punishment. So just as a reminder, reinforcement increases behavior and punishment decreases behavior. Let's look at another example. I don't know why those stars came out weird. But the reason that there's stars next to positive reinforcement is that it's the best one. Positive reinforcement is the best way to change behavior. As a teacher who's worked with young kids, I can tell you punishments are okay. Sometimes they'll work, but much better than punishment is positive reinforcement. I try to catch the kids behaving, doing what I want them to do, and I reward them. Add a reward for desired behavior. That's the best way to condition your subject. But let's look at all four. In the chart, we see that the behavior happens more often with reinforcement. Reinforcement increases behavior. So that top row, positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement increase behavior. The bottom row causes the behavior to happen less often. Positive punishment and negative punishment decrease the behavior. So reinforcement always increases, punishment always decreases, and positive means you're adding something, negative means you're taking something away. Get familiar with this chart. I think it's very helpful in terms of understanding the 4 different types of conditioning. You will need to know these for your quiz and definitely for your exam. Another type of operant conditioning is not quite as straightforward. It's called shaping. Sometimes we aren't able to get the subject to do exactly what we want the first time. For example, if I'm trying to get a pigeon to press a button, it would be great if the pigeon just spontaneously pressed the button and then I could give him some food, right? And then the next time he randomly pressed the button, I'd give him more food, and this would be operant conditioning with positive reinforcement, right? I would be adding something positive, which is food, in order to increase his behavior of pressing the button. But what happens if he never spontaneously presses the button? What happens if that pigeon just sits there all day long next to the button and never presses it? How am I supposed to give him any food and reinforce this behavior? What we do is we use something called shaping. So step 1, give the pigeon food just when it turns toward the button. If it looks at the button or moves its body toward the button, give it food. Keep giving it food as it gets closer and closer to that button. If it moves away from the button, no food. If it moves towards the button, yes, food. Eventually, the pigeon will get all the way over to that button. Then we may need to start reinforcing raising its head to the height of the button. It's getting closer and closer. It's approximating the behavior we want it to do. And we keep rewarding it as it gets closer and closer to pressing that button. Finally, when it does tap the button, we give it food, and we will continue to give it food every time it presses the button, using positive reinforcement to increase the pigeon's behavior of pressing the button. But what shaping is it's rewarding the successive approximations of a target behavior. So if the animal or the person is not already able to do the behavior you want it to do, or it's not already doing it on its own, we need to get it there, reward it for getting closer and closer. Something else important about operant conditioning is that we can use 2 types of reinforcers, primary or secondary reinforcers. So in that example with the pigeon, we gave him food. That's a primary reinforcer. Primary reinforcers are innately pleasurable. It can meet a basic need like food or shelter or safety, things that we just naturally like. Candy and food for animals are a good one. So food for animals or candy for kids are very good primary reinforcers. A secondary reinforcer is used to obtain the primary reinforcer. So you could give somebody money that they can then go out and buy their treat with. Or often in labs and in classrooms, we use tokens or points that the subjects can then use to buy prizes later. So these are secondary reinforcers. If in my classroom I give out tokens to students who are behaving, and then they can use those tokens to buy snacks at the end of the day, the tokens would be a secondary reinforcer used to obtain the primary reinforcer that they want. This part of operant conditioning gets a little bit tricky, but I find it very interesting. It's talking about reinforcement schedules. So far we've been discussing continuous reinforcement, meaning it happens every time. Every time the rat pressed the lever, it got a pellet of food. Every time the pigeon pressed the button, it got some food. You get it every time. But sometimes you can use operant conditioning with partial reinforcement. You don't need to give that prize every single time. So how does it work? You can use a fixed schedule or a random schedule, and you can base your schedule on time or number of behaviors. Let's look at some examples of partial reinforcement. Fixed interval. See how partial splits into fixed and variable, and then fixed splits into interval and ratio. So let's look at fixed interval schedules. Fixed interval means that at a set period of time, the person will be rewarded. So for example, a child who behaves gets weekly allowance. Every week, he gets a reward for behaving. So the reinforcement or the reward is offered after a set period of time. Fixed ratio is offered after a set number of behaviors. So for example, after buying 10 coffees, you get one free. Or after completing 10 worksheets, you get an eraser from the bin. You get a prize or a reinforcement after a set number of behaviors. Moving on to variable schedules, this time instead of a fixed or scheduled time period or number of behaviors, it's random. So a variable interval schedule will give a reinforcement after a random time period. For example, your friend stops by to visit every once in a while. Or when I see my class behaving, I give everybody a treat, but sometimes I do it after 10 minutes, sometimes after 20 minutes, sometimes after 40 minutes. I'll give them the treat every random amount of time. That's a variable interval schedule. Finally, a variable ratio schedule means you're rewarding every random number of behaviors. Slot machines are the best example of this. You keep pressing that button on the slot machine and it will reward you after a random number of presses. And that type, variable ratio schedules, are the most effective in learning. So you will see people pressing that slot machine button a lot more than they would be if it paid out on a fixed interval or ratio or even a variable interval. When it's a variable ratio and we don't know how many behaviors it's going to take to produce the reward, we're more likely to press that button. So again, let's look at our reinforcement schedules and the effects that they have. In the top left of the chart is a fixed interval. Remember, fixed interval means you're rewarded after a set amount of time. It results in a moderate response with a pause after reinforcement. So right after that prize is given or the reinforcement is given, the person or animal will pause for a little bit and continue with a moderate response level. Variable interval on the top right is moderate and steady. So we're using intervals means that it's a moderate behavior, giving it every set amount of time, or this time a random amount of time. And when it's variable interval, instead of having pauses, it's steady. The behavior becomes moderate and steady. Ratios schedules, however, as opposed to interval schedules, result in higher response rates. So a fixed ratio reinforcement schedule will result in high response patterns with pauses after reinforcement. And a variable ratio schedule will result in high and steady behaviors. So if you want that pigeon to press the button as much as possible without pausing, you want to reinforce on a variable ratio schedule, meaning the pigeon gets a pellet of food after every random number of pushes of the button. It has nothing to do with time, it has to do with behaviors, and it's random, not fixed. That's the best way of conditioning. I like how the book explained this one too. Those little notches on each line are the reinforcements. So let's look at the red line on the graph, the variable ratio. That's the one we just talked about that produces the most steady and high behaviors. The highest rate of behaviors and steady. See how that line goes up steadily, nice and straight, almost straight up, because the behaviors are increasing steadily with variable ratio reinforcement. With fixed ratio reinforcement, it's still going up quickly with little pauses after each reinforcement. Variable interval, remember that's random amounts of time that we reinforce after, goes a little bit slower. See how that slope is down lower? The behaviors are increasing slower but steady because it's variable. And then fixed interval reinforcement is slower with nice long pauses after each reinforcement. So we can sort of see the different paths of behavior using the 4 different types of reinforcement schedules. I definitely suggest understanding the reinforcement schedules. I know this can be a little bit tricky. If you're confused at all, please send me an email. I would be more than happy to explain this to you again. As I said, I love this stuff. Almost done with operant conditioning. I want to talk about something called latent learning, which can also involve a cognitive map. A cognitive map is a mental picture. In Edward Tolman's interesting maze experiment, he put some rats into a maze with food at the end and found that the rats quickly learned how to get to the end of the maze and get their food. He put other rats in a maze without food, and they just walked around and explored, and they had no real motivation to get to the end, but they explored and apparently created a cognitive map or a mental picture of the maze. Because when those same rats who were just exploring the maze with no food, when they added food to their maze, they solved that maze lickety-split and got right to the food. They had learned how to do the maze without a motivator. They just weren't ready to do it until the food was there. So they spent their time latent learning that occurs but is not observable until there's a reason to demonstrate it. They took their time latent learning, they learned that maze, created their cognitive map, and then when the reason to demonstrate it came out, when that food was put at the end of the maze, they zoomed right through that maze because they had already learned how, and now they wanted to show it now that the motivator was there. So as soon as they became aware of the food, they could find their way through the maze just as quickly as the comparison group, which had been rewarded with food all along. So they learned just as quickly as the rats who had learned with the food there the whole time. I think latent learning is quite interesting. On to our third type of learning. We learned about classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and now we're going to learn about observational learning. Albert Bandura is the head guy who first started observational learning. Observational learning is defined as learning by watching others and then imitating or modeling what they do or say. And in fact, research suggests that imitative learning like this involves a specific type of neuron called a mirror neuron. And we don't really get into mirror neurons in this course, but they're very interesting. I would suggest looking into them if you're interested. Maybe I'll find a video to post. But Albert Bandura found that social learning theory, which takes cognitive processes into account, can explain a lot of learning that operant and classical conditioning don't explain. And Albert Bandura is famous for his Bobo doll experiment, which we'll get into in a little bit. But the reason it's so important is that he was the one to first suggest that maybe watching violent TV or playing violent video games could lead to aggressive or violent behavior. So what is observational learning? Observational learning is when you learn from a model. And a model can be live, verbal, or symbolic. Live meaning they're there with you, showing you how to do the behavior that you're supposed to learn. Verbal means they're either there or not there, but they're not showing you, they're just telling you how to do it. like Alexa here is telling us to measure 2 cups of flour. A person can tell you instructions as well as a model. And finally, symbolic means that you're modeling something perhaps through a book or a movie. It's not a real one-on-one interaction. So 3 types of models: live, verbal, or symbolic. There's 4 steps in observational learning. The 4 steps are attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. What they're saying is the only way that you're going to learn from watching me is if first you pay attention to me, second, you remember what I do, third, you're able to mimic or imitate what I did, and fourth, you're motivated to mimic or imitate what I did. So there's 4 steps. Pay attention to the model, remember what he or she did, reproduce their behavior, and be motivated to reproduce that behavior. And there are 2 types of motivation that can occur in observational learning. Well, there's lots of types, but 2 that I would like to discuss. One is called vicarious reinforcement, and the other is vicarious punishment. Vicarious means sort of living through somebody else. So when a model is reinforced for their behavior, remember, reinforcement is a good thing. It increases behavior. Those who are watching or observing will also increase their behavior. They'll be motivated to imitate that behavior. However, when the model is punished for the behavior, the people watching will be less likely to imitate this behavior because they saw the model getting punished for it. Let's talk about our Bobo doll experiment real quick. So they had children watch an adult beating up a Bobo doll. The Bobo doll is a plastic clown doll with a heavy bottom, almost like a standing punching bag. And in the video that the kids watched, the adult was acting violently towards the Bobo doll. And some kids watched a video where the adult who was acting violent was rewarded for doing so. The second group of kids watched a video where the adult who was being violent was punished for doing so. And the third group of children watched a video of an adult who was violent towards a Bobo doll with no consequence. And it turns out that many of these kids did repeat this behavior from the model when they were given a chance to interact with a Bobo doll themselves. And those who watched the model getting rewarded or no consequences were more likely to repeat the behavior than those who watched the model being punished. So these results suggest that the punishment has a bigger effect, that vicarious punishment has a bigger effect than vicarious reinforcement, right? We can also see that the boys in general were more aggressive and violent than the girls, which is possibly just due to personality. There have been lots of studies that replicate or do something similar to the Bobo doll study, and a lot have found the same results, that people will imitate or copy or learn from what they see in a video, and they are less likely to copy it if the model in the video was punished. That's it for observational learning, leading us to our Chapter 6 summary. I'll try and go nice and quick. A reflex is an unlearned automatic response by an organism to a stimulus in the environment. Remember, reflexes are automatic. We don't think about them, and they usually involve just one part of our body. An instinct, however, while also unlearned, involves complex patterns of behavior, something like building a nest or sucking on a bottle. Learning is a change in behavior or knowledge that's a result of experience. And associative learning is a form of learning that involves connecting certain stimuli or events that occur together. Both classical and operant conditioning are examples of associative learning. Classical conditioning is when the stimulus occurs before the response and then gets paired with the response. So they ring that bell with the food, the dog salivates, and the bell becomes conditioned, or the salivating becomes a conditioned response to the bell. Higher order conditioning is when we do that same conditioning a second time. So first the dog is conditioned to drool over the bell, and then the dog is conditioned to drool over a black square that has been paired with the bell. Extinction is when you want to decrease the conditioned response by no longer pairing the unconditioned stimulus with the conditioned stimulus. So if we want those dogs to stop drooling over the bell, we continue ringing the bell without pairing it with any kind of food. That will result in extinction. However, when we take a little break from ringing the bell and then start again, something called spontaneous recovery occurs, which is the return of a previously extinguished conditioned response. Stimulus generalization is the conditioned response to stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus. Remember when baby Albert became fearful of all small furry animals? That was stimulus generalization. The opposite of stimulus generalization is stimulus discrimination. The fact that baby Albert did not become scared of dogs or snakes or alligators means that he has stimulus discrimination. Moving on to operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a form of learning in which the stimulus or experience happens after the behavior is demonstrated. So it's an effect or a result. Either the reinforcement or the punishment happens after the behavior. Positive reinforcement is when we add a desirable stimulus to increase the behavior, and positive reinforcement is the best way to influence behavior. When possible, always use positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement involves taking away an undesirable stimulus, also to increase a behavior, right? We can take away, I tell my kid, you don't have to do your chores if you get an A on your test, and if he gets an A on his test, I take away the negative thing, chores, to increase the behavior of studying. Negative reinforcement. Positive punishment, on the other hand, involves adding an undesirable stimulus to stop or decrease a behavior. Maybe every time my son bites his nails, I make him do more chores. I'm adding something undesirable to try to stop him from biting his nails. And finally, negative punishment, taking away something pleasant to decrease or stop the behavior. Maybe when he bites his nails, I take away his phone. I bet he'll stop biting his nails pretty quickly if I took away his phone every time he did that. That would be negative punishment. I'm taking away the pleasant stimulus, the phone, to decrease or stop the nail biting. Over to the right side, shaping is when we use operant conditioning to reward successive approximations toward a target behavior. Remember, shaping was when we wanted to teach the pigeon to press the button, and since the pigeon wasn't already randomly pressing the button, giving us a chance to reinforce that behavior, we started by reinforcing looking at the button, and then reinforcing going near the button, and then reinforcing putting his beak up by the button, and finally reinforcing pressing the button. So shaping means you're rewarding the successive approximations, the closer they get to the behavior. A primary reinforcer has innate reinforcing qualities. The person or animal is born already liking food. They already want it. It has good reinforcing qualities. A secondary reinforcer doesn't have any value in itself. It only has reinforcing qualities because it's linked to something else. The tokens that you give those kids in the classroom don't mean anything unless they can use them to buy a prize. Secondary reinforcers. Now on to the schedules. Partial reinforcement is when you reward behavior only some of the time, or punish behavior only some of the time. And there are 4 types of partial reinforcement schedules. There's fixed interval reinforcement schedule, where behavior is rewarded after a set amount of time, and fixed ratio schedule, where it's rewarded after a set number of responses. Variable interval reinforcement schedule is when behavior is rewarded after an unpredictable amount of time, and variable ratio is where the behavior is rewarded after an unpredictable number of responses. And remember that last one, variable ratio reinforcement schedule, results in high, steady behavior rates. Think of those gambling addicts sitting there pressing that button over and over and over, never knowing how many button presses it takes to get the payout. A cognitive map is a mental picture, which is often used in latent learning. Latent learning is learning that occurs but is not observable until there's a reason to demonstrate it. Those rats didn't need to get out of the maze until the cheese was put there. But once we put the cheese there, they zoomed right out of that maze because they had already learned how. Observational learning is another type of learning which occurs by watching others. Mirror neurons are the neurons responsible for imitation. The steps of observational learning are paying attention, retention or remembering, reproduction or imitating, and motivation. Sometimes motivation can be vicarious punishment or reinforcement. Vicarious punishment is when the observer sees the model being punished, making them less likely to imitate their behavior. And vicarious reinforcement is when the observer sees the model being rewarded, making the observer more likely to imitate the model's behavior. So 3 main types of learning that we learned about today: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. Pavlov was in charge, or the first guy to put forth classical conditioning. Skinner was the first guy to put forth operant conditioning, and Bandura was the first guy to put forth observational learning.